There is a ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that does not exist. It is registered to a billionaire who has not been seen in public for 4 years. It is crewed by men who have signed documents forbidding them from ever describing what they do here. It flies no flag that explains its purpose. And 3 miles beneath its hull, in total darkness, under pressure that would flatten a car engine into the thickness of a coin. Something has been lying on the ocean floor since 1968. 98 men went down with it. Their government looked for them for weeks and found nothing. The CIA found them in 3 days and said nothing. For 6 years, because in those 3 days, the CIA had also found something else. 3 nuclear ballistic missiles, still in their launch tubes, still armed. They were resting on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, 3 miles down, in a Soviet submarine that no one was supposed to know about, and that the most powerful intelligence agency in the world had just decided to steal. Not salvage, not recover, steal. This is the story of Project Azorian, a mission so secret that Congress never voted on its budget of $700 million. So audacious that every engineer consulted said it was physically impossible, and so large that it required the most famous recluse in America to serve as its costume. A mission that built a ship that did not exist, to retrieve a submarine that was not supposed to be found, from a depth that nothing had ever been recovered from before. A mission that succeeded and failed in the same hour. And a mission whose full truth has never been declassified. In the early months of 1968, the Cold War was running at a frequency that most people on Earth could feel but could not name. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in the most expensive standoff in human history. Both sides have enough nuclear weapons to end civilization several times over. Both sides know it. Both sides live with the specific, unspoken terror that one miscalculation, one misread signal, one technical failure, one desperate decision made in a windowless room at 3 in the morning could be the last decision anyone makes. One of the men living inside that reality is Vladimir Kobzar. He is the commanding officer of the K-129, a career naval officer, a man who has spent his adult life in the Soviet submarine service, who understands, as all submarine commanders of his era understand, that the missions he is sent on are the kind that do not come with explanations, only orders. In February 1968, Kobzar receives orders to take the K-129 on a standard deterrence patrol of the North Pacific. He departs Ribachi on schedule. He follows his orders exactly. His family waits for him to come home. He does not come home. Into this world, in February 1968, the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-129 departs the naval base at Ribachi in Kamchatka on a routine patrol of the North Pacific. The K-129 carries 3 nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. It carries 98 men. It carries, in its coding equipment and operational manuals, some of the most sensitive military intelligence in the Soviet arsenal. Somewhere in the North Pacific, in early March 1968, the K-129 stops transmitting. The Soviet Navy launches one of the largest search operations in its history. More than 40 ships, aircraft, everything. They search for weeks in waters that were known to be dangerous, cold, and vast beyond comprehension. They find nothing. What the Soviet Navy does not know, what they will not know for years, is that the United States Navy's sound surveillance system, a network of hydrophones stretched across the floor of the Pacific, detected the implosion of the K-129. In the moment it happened, the Americans knew the exact coordinates. They knew it before the Soviet search began. They said nothing. Instead, a USS Submarine was quietly dispatched to photograph the wreck site. The photographs came back showing something extraordinary. The submarine had not been destroyed. It had sunk, largely intact, to a depth of approximately 5 kilometers, or 16,000 feet, on the floor of the Pacific Ocean. In the Soviet Union, the families of the 98 men were told very little. The official story was that the submarine had been lost during a routine mission. No details, no coordinates, no explanation of what had gone wrong or where their husbands and fathers and sons were resting. The Soviet state was not in the habit of explaining its military losses to the people who suffered them. What those families could not have known, what would have been incomprehensible to them, is that at the very moment they were being told nothing, the government of an adversarial nation already knew exactly where the K-129 lay and was making plans to go there. The photographs also showed the nuclear missiles still in their launch tubes. Inside the CIA, the question was asked quietly in secure conference rooms to people whose clearance levels were high enough to hear it without flinching. Could we raise it? Not hypothetically, not eventually. Could we raise it now, covertly, without the Soviets knowing, and recover the nuclear warheads, the coding machines, and the operational manuals before the ocean destroyed them, or the Soviets found a way to get there first? The engineers they consulted were unanimous. The answer was no. Nothing had ever been recovered from anywhere near that depth. The deepest successful salvage operation in history had recovered an object from less than 1,000 feet. The K-129 was 16 times deeper. The pressure at that depth was 8 tons per square inch. The ocean floor in that region was silted and completely beyond the reach of any existing technology. The CIA took those answers and went back to work. What followed was not an engineering project. It was an act of institutional will, the decision made by a small group of men in positions of extraordinary power that the laws of physics were a negotiating position. They gave the project a code name, Azorian. They gave it a budget that was classified at a level above most members of Congress, and they gave it a cover story that required one of the most famous private citizens in America to play a role he almost certainly did not fully understand. By 1970, Howard Hughes is the perfect cover story. He is worth several $billion. He has business interests in aviation, defense, real estate, film, and mining. He has spent decades operating at the intersection of government and private enterprise in ways that left almost no clean lines between the two. By the early 1970s, he is so reclusive that journalists who attempt to verify his activities are met with silence, lawyers, and contradiction. The CIA chose Hughes not despite his eccentricity, but because of it. This is a paradox that intelligence work occasionally produces. The best cover for an impossible secret is a man whose entire public life is already impossible to verify. Hughes had become, by the early 1970s, a kind of living legend, a figure whose reality and mythology had merged so completely that almost any claim made in his name was simultaneously plausible and unverifiable. He was known to fund strange projects. He was known to pursue obsessions that made no conventional sense. He was known to surround himself with operatives who acted on his behalf without ever revealing his direct involvement. In other words, he was already behaving to the outside world, exactly like a front for a covert operation. The CIA did not invent the cover. They simply walked into the space that Hughes had already created. A cover story only works if no one can scrutinize it. Hughes's empire was so opaque, his behavior so unpredictable, his operations so sprawling that a new division, the Hughes Glomar Explorer Project, supposedly a venture into deep-sea manganese nodule mining, would generate exactly the kind of coverage that intelligence operations require. A little attention, quickly confused, quickly forgotten. The mining story was technically plausible. Deep-sea mineral extraction was a genuine area of commercial interest in the early 1970s. Several legitimate companies were exploring it. Placing a Hughes subsidiary in that space was not suspicious. It was, if anything, exactly the kind of speculative moonshot that Hughes had built his legend on. The ship they built was real. The Glamour Explorer was constructed by Sun Shipbuilding in Chester, Pennsylvania. It was 800 feet long, longer than 2 football fields. It had a derrick at its center that rose 15 stories above the deck. Beneath the hull, a system of thrusters could hold it in position over a fixed point on the ocean floor with a precision that had never been achieved before in maritime engineering. The workers who built it knew they were building something unusual. They did not know what it was for. The engineers who designed the recovery system, a mechanical claw called the capture vehicle, were told they were developing mining technology. The capture vehicle was built to descend 3 miles through the ocean, grip a submarine that had been rotting on the ocean floor for 6 years, and return it to the surface. Some of the engineers suspected otherwise. None of them asked. This is how the CIA builds things, not with conspirators, but with compartments. For 3 years, while the Glomar Explorer was being built, the CIA watched the wreck site. Soviet naval vessels patrolled the region periodically, conducting their own search operations, though with diminishing intensity as the years passed. The intelligence analysts in Langley, who tracked these movements, understood something that the Soviet commanders apparently did not. The K-129 had sunk in a location that was slightly outside the area where the Soviet search had concentrated. The Soviets were looking in the wrong place. But there was a more immediate problem. In the years between 1968 and 1974, the ocean was doing what the ocean does. The K-129 was deteriorating. The pressure, the cold, the biological activity at that depth, all of it was working on the submarine's hull, on the equipment inside, on the cryptographic materials and the warhead assemblies that the CIA needed to recover. There was also a political problem. The Nixon administration was pursuing detente with the Soviet Union. Henry Kissinger was in the middle of negotiations that would eventually produce the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. The diplomatic logic of the moment required a certain kind of restraint, a visible restraint at least, in provocations against Soviet military assets. Recovering a Soviet nuclear submarine was not, technically speaking, restraint. The decision was made at the highest levels of the administration. The operation would proceed. If the Soviets discovered what was happening, the diplomatic consequences would be managed. If the operation succeeded, the intelligence value would justify everything. On July 4th, 1974, the Glomar Explorer arrived at the target site. The operation required the Glomar Explorer to hold position over a fixed point on the ocean floor for weeks, demanding extraordinary precision. The ship's dynamic positioning system, 12 thrusters controlled by a computer that was considered extraordinary for its time, maintained its location to within a few meters despite the currents, the swells, and the winds of the open Pacific. Below the hull, a large opening in the center of the ship, called the moon pool, allowed the capture vehicle to be deployed directly downward into the water. The capture vehicle was lowered on a pipe string, a series of sections assembled one at a time from the derrick on the ship's deck. Each section was locked into place, and then the string descended a little further. It took days. The ocean floor was 3 miles away, and each pipe section was 30 feet long. The entire time, Soviet ships were watching. 2 Soviet vessels had arrived in the area shortly after the Glomar Explorer. They circled, they photographed, they used equipment that the CIA analysts knew was sophisticated enough to detect certain types of subsurface operations. The crew of the Glomar Explorer was instructed to behave as ocean miners, to conduct surface activities consistent with the cover story, to interact with Soviet personnel if approached with the practiced calm of men who had nothing to hide. The Soviets watched. They did not intervene. On the ocean floor, 3 miles below, the capture vehicle had reached the K-129. 6 years of sitting on the bottom of the Pacific had done what 6 years does to metal under pressure. The submarine was partially buried in silt. Its hull was corroded in sections. The capture vehicle's claws extended. They found purchase on the hull. The hydraulic systems engaged. Slowly, over days, the pipe string began to retract. The submarine was moving. It was rising. For the engineers monitoring the sensors aboard the Glomar Explorer, this was the moment. 6 years of planning, $700 million, the careers and reputations of everyone involved. All of it was suspended in the movement of a metal object, ascending through 3 miles of cold water. At approximately 2,000 meters from the surface, the sensors registered an anomaly. Then a sound. Several of the capture vehicle's claws had failed. The hull of the K-129, weakened by 6 years of ocean pressure and corrosion, had fractured under the stress of the ascent. The forward section of the submarine, the section containing the ballistic missile tubes, the nuclear warheads, the cryptographic equipment that the entire operation had been designed to recover, broke away. It fell back to the ocean floor. The Glomar Explorer recovered approximately 1/3 of the K-129. What that third contained has never been fully disclosed. The CIA has acknowledged, in the years since the operation was partially declassified, that the recovered section did not include the nuclear warheads or the primary cryptographic equipment. These were in the forward section that broke away and returned to the ocean floor, where they remain today. What the recovered section did contain, according to documents that have been selectively released and partially redacted, included the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors, Soviet torpedoes, and documents whose intelligence value the CIA has consistently declined to specify. The 6 sailors were in the AFT section of the submarine, the section that held together long enough to reach the surface. They were recovered intact enough to be identified. The CIA's medical personnel examined them. Their personal effects were cataloged, and then, in a ceremony that was filmed in its entirety and stored in the CIA's classified archive, they were buried at sea. The ceremony was conducted in Russian. A CIA officer read passages from the Soviet naval burial rites. The Soviet flag was flown over the Glomar Explorer, a Soviet flag on an American intelligence ship, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, for 6 men whose government did not yet know they had been found. That film sat in a vault for 18 years. In 1992, after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union no longer existed, the CIA director Robert Gates gave a copy of the film to the Russian government. The Russian officials who received it watched Americans burying Soviet sailors with Soviet rights in the middle of an ocean, while simultaneously extracting intelligence from their submarine. It is unclear what they said about this privately. Publicly, they said very little. That silence is itself significant. When the story broke publicly in 1975, the Soviet government's response was measured, careful, and strategically vague. They neither confirmed that the K-129 had carried the materials the CIA was trying to recover, nor denied that the American operation had succeeded in recovering something valuable. They did not escalate. They did not demand explanations through diplomatic channels in any way that created a formal record. Intelligence professionals who have analyzed that silence for decades have noted what it implies: a government that knew something had been taken, understood roughly what it was, and calculated that the cost of acknowledging the loss publicly was higher than the cost of absorbing it quietly. In February 1975, journalist Seymour Hersh was preparing to publish a story in the New York Times about Project Azorian. CIA Director William Colby asked him to hold the story on national security grounds. Hersh agreed, temporarily. Then a different journalist, Jack Anderson, published the story on national radio. The cover was broken. The Glomar Explorer was exposed. Howard Hughes's mining venture was revealed to the world as what it had always been: a prop, a costume, an elaborate fiction built to conceal the most expensive covert operation in American history. Project Azorian cost $700 million in 1974, the equivalent of approximately $4 billion today. It was funded entirely outside the normal congressional appropriations process, through mechanisms whose full details remain classified. The legislators who were briefed on it were a handful of committee chairs, sworn to secrecy, shown enough to authorize continued funding, but not enough to understand the full scope of what they were authorizing. The Glomar Explorer was eventually transferred to the United States Navy, then leased to a private company, then used for actual deep-sea oil drilling, a vessel built for one of the most extraordinary secret missions in history. Repurposed for ordinary industrial work, it was scrapped in 2015. The section of the K-129 that broke away, the section with the nuclear warheads, the missiles, the cryptographic equipment, is still on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, in the same place it landed in 1968, 57 years ago. The CIA has never confirmed exactly what was found in the section it did recover. The intelligence value of the operation, the actual return on $700 million, and 6 years of extraordinary engineering and elaborate deception, remains officially undisclosed. There is a phrase that became part of the bureaucratic vocabulary of American intelligence as a direct result of Project Azorian. When journalists and researchers began filing Freedom of Information Act requests for documents related to the Glomar Explorer, the CIA's response was consistent, precise, and legally novel. We can neither confirm nor deny. That phrase, coined specifically to handle inquiries about Azorian, has since been adopted by intelligence agencies around the world as the standard response to questions they cannot answer without answering. It is now so common that most people who use it have no idea where it came from. It came from a ship that did not exist, built to retrieve a submarine the world was not supposed to know, had been found, funded by a government that could not admit what it was doing, and operated under the name of a man whose life had become so strange that one more impossibility barely registered. Vladimir Kobzar left a wife and 2 children behind in Kamchatka. His family spent decades not knowing where he was, not knowing what had happened, not knowing that the answer to their question was sitting in a classified archive on the other side of the world. 3 miles below the surface of the Pacific, 92 Soviet sailors are still there. The 6 who were recovered got a ceremony, a film, a delayed acknowledgement. The 92 are still waiting. And somewhere in a government building whose address is not publicly listed, in a filing system whose index is not publicly accessible, there are documents that explain exactly what Project Azorian found. Documents that would tell us whether $700 million and 6 years of extraordinary deception changed the course of the Cold War, or whether the forward section of the K-129 took those answers back to the bottom with it. Those documents are still classified. We can neither confirm nor deny.